I'm Joanna Tavares. I'm a marine scientist, now pursuing a PhD in Earth System Science at UCI. And today I'm here to talk about global carbon sinks. So JT was my advisor on the jokes to include in this presentation. He told me to put those pictures there. So no, I'm not talking about home improvement. You already heard a lot about ideas on how to, improve your home if you're trying to find ways to get a greener lifestyle. So I'm not going to be talking about these sinks. The sinks I'm going to be talking about look more like these. Aren't they beautiful? So these are global carbon sinks. These are places on Earth in which the carbon that we're emitting in the form of greenhouse gases ends up after a while. Okay? Not all of it, but a lot of it. And they really function as sinks because they're draining this carbon from the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere into these compartments. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. All right, now you've heard several times already that we humans are putting an unprecedentedly high amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, right? But how much is it? What is the amount of greenhouse gases that we are putting out? Would anyone know the number from the top of their head? Like some kind of mass, a measurement of the mass of the greenhouse gases? 50 gigatons. It's very good to see we have people who know a lot of stuff. So my estimate is that an average for the past decade, so it's a little bit lower than that. This past year, we're estimating that we emitted 56 gigatons of CO2 equivalent last year. So this number is a little bit lower because we're working with an average for the past few years. And a gigaton, just so you know, it's the equivalent of 1 billion tons. Okay, 1 billion tons. And CO2 equivalent is a very convenient unit for us to use because it allows us to account for other greenhouse gases besides CO2. Would anyone remember the name of the other greenhouse gases? Methane, nitrous oxide, so CFC. So all these other greenhouse gases, they get to be counted in this number here. So this CO2 equivalent is a very convenient unit for us to be using, okay? So this number is a number that you're going to hear again. I'm going to refer to this number later on. So I'm a former community college professor. So if this feels a lot like a lecture, I'm sorry. I can't help. I might give you a quiz at the end just to make sure that you're paying attention. All right, so sorry, I skipped here. I told you I can't make these jokes too funny. I get distracted. So 4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, right? And most of it is coming from the burning of fossil fuels. So the combustion of oil, coal, gas, that's responsible for over 80 to 90%, okay, depending on what year you're looking at. And then you have another 20% that's coming from this other source, the source that we call land use change. And land use change is a term that refers to all the change that we humans have been making on the surface of the planet to adjust those natural ecosystems, those natural habitats to our needs. And most of these needs are associated with food production, okay? So this is a picture from my home country in Brazil, my home country of Brazil, right here. And what you see, this is the classic example of land use change. It's deforestation. The trees are being cut down. This is the Amazon. And what you're looking at here is the area that has been completely destroyed and removed in order to make room for industrial scale cattle grazing. This is happening in Brazil. Brazil is the largest exporter of beef in the world. And I'll give you some more numbers later to put that in context. Okay, so land use change includes all this 20% of the total emissions is accounting all the emissions associated with converting natural habitat into pastures and new farmland. It also includes, the cows are just running wild there. But we got, this 20% of overall emissions from land use also includes emissions associated with the activities themselves. So you might have heard that cows fart and burp methane, right? So that's included in that 20% overall emissions. The way we're farming right now is releasing carbon that had been stored in the soils for hundreds to thousands of years. It's releasing it's releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Those emissions are included here in this 20% of the overall emissions, okay? So this diagram summarizes what I just said. You have the two arrows there showing you the main sources, right? 80 to 90% here, 10 to 20% here. And so this is all going into the atmosphere every year. But not all these emissions stayed there. Not all these greenhouse gases will stay there. Only half of this CO2 equivalent that we talked about will stay there. The other half will actually go into what we call these carbon sinks. So these carbon sinks are shown here. And you have about a quarter of our man-caused emissions going into the land sink, and the other quarter going into the ocean sink. All right? So the Earth is actually reclaiming some of these gases and doing this job of removing some of it in the atmosphere. Whatever stays in the atmosphere, which is about half, accumulates with what was there already from previous years, and that's what causes the warming. So the 50% that stays here and that accumulates over time, that causes the planet to become warmer. What goes in the sinks prevents the planet from getting warmer. Does that make sense? Yes? All right. So, oh boy. Okay. What can we do to increase the amount of carbon that goes into these sinks? That's the driving question of this presentation. All right? And you bet you're going to get a quiz in the end, right? Okay. I just miss being in the classroom so much. It's pretty obvious now. All right, so in order to answer that question, first we need to understand how these sinks work. What controls these sinks? How can we manipulate these sinks in some way, right? How can we change those sinks in some way to help with the climate crisis? So we need to understand how these sinks work. And the first one we're going to tackle is the land carbon sink. So what are the mechanisms that control the amount of CO2 that gets taken into the sink? And for that, we're going to have to remember stuff that we learned in grade school, okay? Who here is able to tell me the name of the process in which plants remove carbon dioxide, CO2, from the atmosphere and return oxygen into the air? Photosynthesis, very good. Yes, and that is the controlling mechanism for the land carbon sink. And so I brought here my friend, the plant, to illustrate this process, okay? This plant is doing photosynthesis right now as we speak, right in front of our eyes. So right now, this plant is removing air, right, from the surroundings. The air contains carbon dioxide. It's bringing in this carbon dioxide through tiny, tiny little pores on the leaves called stomatas. It opens up the stomatas. It removes these gases from the atmosphere here, from what's around it. It goes into the plant. Inside of the plant, this plant now is going to deconstruct the carbon dioxide molecule. The CO2 molecule, it's going to break it apart. It's going to physically remove the oxygen from the CO2 and release that oxygen back into the atmosphere. The oxygen goes back, and the plant retains the carbon, right? Why on earth is this plant retaining carbon? What is it going to do with it? Carbohydrates, yes. See, finally some use for all that stuff you had to memorize in school. Carbohydrates. And most people are very okay and very comfortable with the notion that these carbohydrates are going to be used for the energy, like we say that plants make their own food, right? So it's using for its own energy needs. What a lot of people get surprised to realize is that the carbon that the plant removed from the air around it becomes the building block for the plant itself. What you're looking at here, if you remove the water that the plant got from the soil, is carbon. It's carbon. This plant is literally making its own body out of thin air. So for as long as this plant lives, if I could take good care of it, maybe 3-4 years, I'm not a very good plant care. They don't bark, they don't meow. It's really hard to know what they need. But if I take good care of it, 2-3 years maybe it will live. And that carbon that the plant removed from the air to make its body and to continue rebuilding it, it's locked in the plant. If it's locked in the plant, it's not in the atmosphere. If it's not in the atmosphere, it's not warming the planet up. Now, this is a small plant. Like I said, it will live a few years. But now imagine sequoia trees. Imagine those giant trees in the Amazon that are huge, massive, and they live for hundreds of years. For as long as that plant is alive, it's locking carbon away from the atmosphere. It's storing carbon. It serves as a carbon storage unit. Does that make sense? What's more, most plants will be removing more CO2 than what they need to use for their energy needs or for their structural needs. And so the excess carbon that they're removing from the atmosphere, they will be transferring into the soil. And if this soil is undisturbed, if the soil is healthy, if the soil is in a healthy ecosystem, this soil now becomes a storage unit for carbon as well. So the carbon that the plant is removing, transferring to the soil, can stay locked in this soil for hundreds to thousands of years. Does that make sense? So that's how the land carbon sink works. You have these plants, these trees, doing photosynthesis, removing carbon, moving into the soil, That's the basic functioning here. Now in the ocean, it's different. Okay? Photosynthesis happens in the oceans. Half of the photosynthesis on the planet happens in the ocean. But it's done by this tiny, tiny microscopic organism called phytoplankton. And these phytoplankton live very short lives. They get eaten by very small animals, and then they get eaten by the small animals get eaten by small fish. So throughout this process, we lose most of this carbon through photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is not the controlling mechanism in the ocean carbon sink for the time scales that we're interested in. It works in like millions of years, but we don't have millions of years to deal with climate change, right? So in the ocean, the 25% of human emissions that are being taken up by the ocean is mostly going into the ocean through a combination of chemical and physical processes. Now, this diagram that I chose to put here was the most, I understand it's very complicated. It has a number of chemical reactions, and so for the next 15 minutes, we're just gonna go through all of them. You're welcome. I'm not going to do that. We're not going to go through all the equations, but I wanted to put it up here so you understand that there are a number of sequential chemical reactions and chemical balance that control this process. It starts with a physical process in which the CO2 that is in the atmosphere has to physically mix with the seawater. So you need to have some turbulence at the boundary layer where the sea meets the atmosphere here. So you have this mixing. And then a chemical reaction happens. The CO2 has to dissolve in seawater, and it chemically binds itself to the seawater. Okay? Then, through all these other complicated sequential chemical reactions, that CO2 becomes part of the chemical makeup of the seawater. It changed the chemistry of the seawater. It becomes bound to the seawater. Does that make sense? And so now this CO2 is going to travel with ocean currents. It's going to go all the way to the bottom of the ocean. It's going to go through what we call the global conveyor belt. It is trapped in the ocean for hundreds to thousands of years. So that's why it is sequestering carbon. It's really removing carbon from the atmosphere and keeping it away from the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. So the other physical process that has to happen is for the sinking of this CO2-rich water. Okay, so this is great, right? In many ways, this is helping us to not live in a warmer planet. If it weren't for these sinks, including the ocean sink, we would already be in a much warmer planet. But for the ocean, it's coming at a very high cost for the ocean. In the process of taking up this CO2 from the atmosphere, the ocean is becoming more acidic. Those chemical reactions that you saw, in the end, what you end up with is a more acidic result. And so that is very harmful to marine life. The classic example are the corals, as you can see here, before acidification and after acidification. Anything that makes their bodies with calcium carbonate will be suffering. Not just corals. There are lots of other organisms that are suffering. So if anything, if we could, we would actually want to prevent more CO2 from going into this ocean sink. All right, so, oops, sorry, like skipping. So the question that I asked in the beginning was, all right, so is there anything that we can do in order to increase those sinks and or minimize the sources, right? Are there any change that we can make in the sinks that you saw that could actually help us to deal with the climate crisis? So from what we just talked about, any ideas of one thing that we could do? Plant trees, yes. I hope it's not because you saw this already. The teacher who's giving the answer before the exam. Yes, plant trees, right? We already understood that if having more trees is a good thing. It's a way to help the problem here, to solve the problem. All right, but it's not just about going planting any trees anywhere, okay? Don't go to Home Depot tonight and like just buy a bunch of trees and go. It's not that. In fact, if you plant the wrong tree in the wrong place, you're doing more harm than good. The good news is that we have so much science on this. There are hundreds, thousands of scientists dedicating their lives to studying this. We have detailed math. Here in this audience, raise your hand if you're a plant scientist, right here. Look at that. So there is so much science developed on that. We as a society have scientific knowledge ready to go. We know where to plant, what kind of plants to plant, the management strategies to make them thrive. So planting trees, in a way, is supporting programs that are science-based and ecosystem-based management programs, okay? Protecting existing forests and wetlands, it's included there, right? As I mentioned before, deforestation in Brazil is something that was stabilized for the past decades, and now it's on the rise again. The past 3 years in Brazil, we saw, actually, sorry, this is a global number. In the world, we've seen an increase in deforestation by 65% compared to the past 14 years, just in the last 3 years. So, obviously, we need to do a better job of protecting what's still there. Oh, that's where the question went. Okay. The next one is something that might not be, the JT mentioned already. It might not be something that people have like understanding. It's not something that is very intuitive. But I'm just going to give this to you. We are wasting almost 30 to 50% of the food we produce on the planet Earth is ending up on landfills. I'm going to say this again. As much as half of the food that the planet produces is going into the landfill. Okay? And that's a problem because we're not only wasting 50% of the emissions that were used to produce this food, we're also, once this food is in a landfill, it releases methane, which is one powerful greenhouse gas. So it's a double whammy. We have now a situation in which we're not only not being efficient in the way that we are using our resources, but we're also causing a problem afterwards. Now, this is a problem that is systematic. So we have, the consumers are responsible. We also have a system that is producing food in a way that is not sustainable. So that goes all the way back. Most of this waste actually happens at the production, at the farms. If the vegetables are ugly, they don't send it to the market because people are not going to buy it. And so that, just ends up in a pile of rotting food somewhere in the corner. If it were a country, global food waste would be the third largest emitter in the world, only behind China and the United States, if global food waste was a country. Okay? So that should give us an understanding of what that means. Restore soils. So using plant varieties that have deeper roots, practicing these techniques that we call regenerative agriculture, that includes also agroforestry, enriching the soils with organic material. There's something called biochar that you might have heard that we know increases the sequestration of carbon in soil. So there's lots of, again, we have a lot of science on this again. It's not because we don't know what to do, okay? We need to move away from monocultures. We need to move away from these industrial scale farming operations that rely heavily on plowing, that rely heavily on fertilizers. Again, lots of science exists on this. Oh, what happened to my slides? Okay, so regenerative agriculture, which I mentioned, it's an umbrella term. It encompasses several different ways to farm. And, a lot of times I tell people, this is scientifically feasible. This is technically feasible. And they say, but it's not economically feasible. Well, here's something that might change people's minds. This study here, again, it's from Project Drawdown, that website that JT mentioned earlier. They estimated that if we were to expand regenerative agriculture from the current 108 million acres globally to the maximum potential, which would be 1 billion acres by 2050, we would be looking at $1.9 trillion in financial return by 2050 on an investment of $57 billion. Now, I'm not very good at money. You can ask my ex-husband about that. Not very good at money, but this looks like a darn good investment to me. Okay, so there's something to be said about making decisions now that will save us and our kids' monies. Okay? All right, so all in all, if we were to implement all these nature-based solutions and do that associated with changing diets, consuming less beef, consuming more plants, eating locally, we could cut land use emissions to half. So we could use those land emissions that you saw could be reduced to half, and at the same time, we would be increasing our sink, so sinking an extra 4 to 12 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. So when you take that into account, we're looking at a 10 to 30% of that reduction in annual emissions. What's our target by 2030? How much do we need to cut our annual emissions? 50%. 50%, if you forget everything you saw here today, you have to remember this. Our goal is to cut emissions, annual emissions, by 50% by the year 2030, so that we can stay on track to be fossil fuel free by 2050. That's what will keep us below this 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. Now, as you saw and heard here, it might not even be possible, but this should be our goal. And the possibility is really depending on how fast we start to act, how aggressive our actions are. I am telling you here, it's technically, scientifically, and economically feasible. The holdup right now is what we as societies can do quickly enough in 10 years. Can we make those changes in 10 years, right? And those changes have to happen bottom up from what we can do here as people, as individuals, and top down. Okay, so bioengineering and geoengineering, you heard about carbon capture. I really don't know what happened to my slides. I'm sorry about that. Was that what you meant by putting some jokes in my talk? Is like, did you change my headings while I wasn't looking? Okay, so carbon capture and storage, right? This is something that you've heard today. It's something that in many of these projections we're considering. And my takeaway here from this study, what I studied for this presentation, is that we have to proceed with caution, okay? I told you we have a lot of scientific information on how to deal with forests and trees. We don't know a lot about the possible issues from implementing and scaling up some of these bioengineering and geoengineering strategies. They might be important and we might need to use them, so we need to continue studying them and we need to consider looking into what the pros and cons are, okay? So proceed with caution. So what can you do to help? Well, obviously eating less meat is the one takeaway, but there's more to it. It's more about understanding where your food comes from. It's not just about eating less meat. If you can do that, that's great. That's a huge, easy, first, well, for me it's very hard. I'm from Brazil. And we eat a lot of meat there. It's part of our culture. It's part of our social gatherings. So I still eat meat, but I've reduced substantially the amount of meat that I eat. And I think that that's a good first step that is easy for most people to do. But there are other stuff. Shrimp, most of the shrimp we consume in the United States is coming from countries that are destroying their wetlands, destroying their mangrove forests to grow this shrimp. Nutella, peanut butter. I'm sorry, this is why the crying face is specifically for Nutella here. What's in Nutella that is harming forests? Who knows? Palm oil. Very good. So palm oil. So all this stuff, we just need to understand what we're eating. Where is it coming from? What are the impacts associated with that? Of course, you've already heard, join organizations. You're going to have a number of organizations exhibiting outside, support policies and programs, protest, join your children in the streets because they're already there, right? Let's join them. Find like one protest a month. You can go online and find them. Vote, right? This is an election year. And so we should be making climate change on the top 3 issues, voting issues. That should be something that we're able to do because it will affect all the other voting issues pretty much. Okay, so we need to help people understand that. There is locally, I didn't add to my slide, but locally there are some initiatives that are happening, and you're going to learn more outside. You're going to have a number of exhibitors. There's one locally, the Climate Energy. Is Erin here? Yeah, Eric is here. Well, anyways, you're going to meet people that can help you to figure out how to bring this to local action. Okay? I think there's some kind of vote that is important on Monday. All right, so that's what I have for today. Before I go, I'm going to introduce you to David because he's going to shift gears, okay? David is going to now bring us locally. He's going to talk about a case study of how everyday people can make a difference by joining forces with other everyday people and preserve an ecosystem to look at the problem from this ecosystem-based approach. So we're shifting gears from global and national, and then at the end, we're going to be able to bring it all together with our keynote speaker that's going to talk about environmental justice. All right? So thank you.